Today is July 7th, 2004, and we are at the Warhawk Air Museum in Nampa, Idaho. Today we are interviewing Mr. Merle Culp as part of the Veterans History Project in conjunction with the Library of Congress. My name is Sue Paul. I will be doing the interviewing. Also present in the room is the director, Alice Hill, and Mr. Culp. Mr. Culp, welcome to the Warhawk Air Museum. It's an honor to be interviewing you today. Could you please tell me, sir, where you were born and what year you were born?
I was born in 1918 in Pennsylvania, Ford City, Pennsylvania.
And sir, where do you live today? What is your current address?
My current address is Parma, 24047 Bat Corner Road, and
in Parma, Idaho.
Parma, Idaho.
And sir, what war or wars did you serve in, and what division of the military were you in?
I was in World War II and the Korean War. I started out in the Army Air Corps and stayed in the service until 1962.
Merle, could you tell me a little bit about where you grew up and what your family was like?
I grew up on a farm about 40 miles northeast of Pittsburgh, a small farm, and
Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania?
In Pennsylvania.
Mm-hmm.
And after going to school locally, I attended high school in Ford City, and then I worked, after my father died in 1935, I worked supporting the farm, and I drove truck. I worked in a pottery. I worked for a while in the Pittsburgh Plate Glass Company, and about that time I heard about some outfit, the Army, would pay you $75 a month to learn how to fly. I was also going to night school at Carnegie Tech at the time.
Were you living with your mother, and did you have a family? I mean, did you have brothers and sisters?
My mother, I was the oldest of 7 children, and I was very fortunate to have good teachers at home. My grandmother was also a teacher, and I got through high school the time I was 15, and I decided that I'd better go to college. Well, my father died after my first semester in college. I didn't finish my education until 1951 after being in the Air Force. I joined the Air Force in December of 1941. At this time I was employed by the Pennsylvania Railroad, and
yeah.
It was a difficult decision. I did not have to go in, but I was too young to resist the pull of getting involved.
Where were you December 7th, 1941?
I remember 1939, my birthday, the 1st of September. The Germans had invaded Poland. And I remember telling my mother, this war is going to last for 5 years. We don't realize how dangerous the Nazis are. And mark my word, Mother, I think the Japanese, it will possibly take 10 years.
Why did you think the Japanese?
We were already getting evidence that they were our enemy. Keep in mind,
through the newspapers?
The 7th of December was still coming up. And fortunately, the Japanese war didn't take as long as I had thought at the time.
You said you were already getting word the American public was, what, through newspapers? Or how were we kind of being told that this was escalating?
It's hard to say. I tried to keep abreast of current events.
Yeah, it sounds like you were good at that.
And by the time I was by the time I joined the Air Force, or the Army, I was already 23 years old, and I had worked around. I had a lot of exposure. My great supervisor at the Pennsylvania Railroad tried to talk me out of going into the service. He said, "You don't have to, you're the head of a family." And it was a difficult decision, but I had to go learn to fly, and I had to get in the action.
So you did. You joined the Army Air Corps.
Because I was a great patriot or anything. I was young and energetic, and besides, my 6 brothers and sisters, they could take over and run the farm for us.
So you joined the Army Air Corps.
I joined the Army Air Corps.
And where did they send you for your training?
I was first assigned to Lackland Air Base, Kelly Field, in Texas, San Antonio, Texas. Then I trained in primary flying school at Pine Bluff, Arkansas, basic school at Randolph Field, and advanced school at Victoria, Texas. I was trained as a fighter pilot.
Yeah, I was going to ask you what your choice was.
Then I got my assignment to active duty after becoming a second lieutenant on the 5th of August, 1942, to, of all things, a twin-engine monster, B-25. Fortunately, I loved the airplane. We adapted to it and had a great organization. The organization I joined was composed of a number of people who had been with Doolittle on the Hornet and the Tokyo invasion. So I was well trained in B-25s. They were the best experts in the world. We trained in Columbia, South Carolina and Myrtle Beach, learning how to fly the airplane and learn how the guns worked and bomb and so on. Eventually, we made some long distance, low level flights, one being 1,000 miles overland flight from Walterboro, South Carolina to Ellington Field, Texas, and we never got above 50 feet. We had a special permit because of the training requirements.
This was training you to go where?
To train us so we could fly anywhere in the world at low altitude and navigate at low level. So here we were dodging bridges and telephone lines and radio towers, and we made a successful flight to Houston. And then on the return flight, we couldn't get a clearance, and we had to go to 5,000 feet to get above the clouds. On the way back, I and my crew decided we don't want to fly this high. We dropped down through the clouds to get back down to 50 feet illegally. And as we broke out of the clouds at about 500 feet over the flat East Texas oil fields, we suddenly ran into a flock of Canadian geese. And 3 geese hit the B-25, knocked out the oil pressure on one of the engines, and we had no choice but to turn around, head back to Ellington Field that we had just left 30 minutes before. We made a successful single-engine landing, but the airplane was torn up pretty badly from 3 geese.
Now you were piloting the airplane?
I was piloting the airplane, and everybody was happy, of course, that we were able to get down safely.
How'd the B-25 fly on one engine?
Very well. And the interesting thing is that we were coming in to land. The radio had announced at Ellington Field, which was a training base at the time for other airplanes, that there was a B-25 coming in with one engine on it. And I remember looking, I saw all these people in cars out on the ramp. Are they watching an airplane land, or are they looking for a wreck? We managed to land and got back to the airstrip and parking ramp on one engine. About 4 weeks later, the airplane was repaired. However, I had been grounded and flown back to our base at Walterboro to wait further orders.
And what were your further orders? When were you sent overseas?
Continue flying, but don't break the rules.
How long before you were sent overseas then into combat? How long before you were sent overseas into combat?
We trained for another period at Eglin Field, flying with torpedoes under the airplane, so we could drop them on shipping wherever they might be. And we did some support work for the Army at DeRidder, Louisiana, for close support work. And on about the 1st of March, 1943, we were alerted that we would be going over to Africa. And we departed Florida, Homestead Air Base, on the 15th of February, and flew across the Atlantic Ocean as a group, 60 airplanes. And we arrived in, by way of South America, Ascension Island, Liberia, Dakar, Marrakech, and a little North African town in Algiers, Ain Malila. And we flew our first combat mission on the 15th of March, 1943. It was low-level flying in the Kasserine Pass to support the Army, who was in trouble at that time because of the Germans coming across North Africa. On our trip over, after landing on the on the west coast of Africa, we flew north from Dakar to Morocco and Marrakech, stayed overnight, and I think maybe 2 nights. Then we flew on to Algiers, a place called Ain Malila, and that's where we set up our tents and started flying missions from Ain Malila over into the Tunisian area. The Germans were coming across this way in the Kasserine Pass down in here. Mm-hmm. We flew low altitude missions over there, trying to hit tanks, bomb any railroad connections, and try to disrupt the oncoming Germans any way we could.
What was the danger to you? Flak or enemy aircraft?
The greatest danger at that time was low fire from the Germans out in here. And they had some 88 millimeter cannons, but they weren't too effective on us. As we come in, drop our bombs, sometimes they're 100-pounders, fragmentation bombs, and anything that would disrupt the troops. And we hit them with so many missions that it wasn't long until the Germans were in total disarray.
How many of your planes would go out at a time to do these raids?
We would fly in never less than a squadron at a time of 12 airplanes, but usually 24 airplanes.
Did you have fighter support?
Sometimes we did, sometimes we didn't. The Germans didn't have too many fighters down there at that time. And that story changed, of course, as the war progressed.
What was it like, a farm boy from Pennsylvania going across the ocean like that with a whole load of B-25s and almost immediately going right into combat? What was that like for you mentally? I mean, what did you think? Or did you think anything?
It was quite an experience. We knew we were capable of doing anything that we were asked to do, but to fly that first mission and not know what the results would be, We didn't even think about it. The odds were in our favor. And it was a great adventure to go out here and see if we could knock out some tanks or if we could hit the target. Some railroad junctions down here. And there were troops scattered all around. We'd come in low and drop our fragmentation bombs and hopefully not get hit. We didn't get hit very much down there in North Africa.
Did you ever have flak hit you?
Oh yes, but it was very little.
In that area. Where did you go from there?
From when the Germans were subdued in Tunis, we moved up to 2 other bases and waited here for a while. And at that time, we flew missions over to a little island right here between Sicily and Tunis called Pantelleria. That was the milk run of the war. There was no flak or anything, but we just totally disabled Pantelleria, which was a German sea base. And then we started flying missions over into Sicily to support some of the army troops and the British that were already on Sicily. Eventually, we were flying missions from here up into the southern part of Italy. As Sicily became disabled and the Germans were moving back in Italy, we moved over next to a little town called Brutalia near Taranto, Italy. And from Taranto area, we flew missions down to Greece, Athens, up into what was then Yugoslavia, and all along here to rout the Germans from this area.
This is a journal that you kept, and I'll just put it right here in front of this. It's a calendar that you carried with you during these missions, and on the back of this, you journalized your missions. And if I may, I'd like to just read several of them as we're talking. One is Pantelleria. This is 6/11/1943. Pantelleria surrenders. First time in history any place bombed into submission. 920 planes dropped 1,300 tons of bombs in one day. That was one of your missions.
That particular mission included not only our B-25 group, but several other groups.
Did you have B-17s with you?
B-17s and B-26s, and anybody to make a great big splash and let them know that we didn't take any resistance lightly.
Were very many of our planes lost during that time?
Very few. Mm-hmm. We first started to get into the resistance from the German Focke-Wulf 190s, Goering's Yellow Noses they were called, who were stationed in Sicily and over in Italy. And when they came over, they first came after us knowing that the B-25s didn't have any guns in the tail. Well, did they get a surprise? Because from a 12-ship formation, we could bring, take about 6 times at 72 guns to bear on an airplane coming in on you. We shot down a number of the Focke-Wulf 190s in this area. It was a great heyday, and the Germans took quite a beating.
Did you have fighter escort then?
Yes.
During that, what type of fighter planes were with you?
We had fighter escort from the P-40s that could stay with us out to here, and also from the P-38s that we had giving us fighter support. The famous Black Squadron boys were flying the P-40s and did a marvelous job. But they couldn't go too far because they'd run out of fuel. They did a great job covering for us as far as they could go. And the P-38s, they had longer range. And later on, we used the P-38s to support us all the way over into long missions. They could go much further than the P-40s.
Were any of the, was your plane ever hit?
I had the privilege most of the time of being a flight leader, and we occasionally picked up a little bit of flak. If we could see the black flak ahead of us, we knew which way to go to take evasive action.
What did flak do to an airplane? Tell us about flak, because it was as deadly as being shot at, wasn't it?
The German 88 millimeter guns were very accurate. And if we stayed on a steady course for more than 15, 20 seconds, it was very likely there might be a burst within lethal range. So we, when we knew we were getting flak from the ground, we would try to alter our course 500 feet, go right or left, and so on. But usually this was only in the area of a target. And once we got through the target and dropped our bombs, we were out of it. We flew in mostly from 4,000 feet to 10,000 feet, whereas the heavier bombers, the B-17s, went in usually at 20,000 feet above. We were able to do more damage to bridges and railroads than the heavier bombers because at lower altitude we were more effective. And at that altitude, we sometimes caught more 20 millimeter and less of the heavy stuff. We were in fast and out. So we didn't get too much damage. The worst damage that we got was from some sea sweeps where the Germans might be moving some shipping around, and they had what they called Siebel ferries. They were barges just loaded with guns. And our orders were, if we saw one of those out in this area, stay away from it. If we lost some of our early mission pilots running sea sweeps. That was where we had our greatest losses, where a pilot would come in at low altitude toward a ship that was loaded, and he was sitting duck. Unfortunately, those were our greatest losses.
At 9/7/43, you went to Malta.
In July, I and 4 other officers from different units in North Africa were summoned to General Eisenhower's headquarters in Algiers to go on a special mission. We were told very little other than we were supposed to take a roll of papers and fly to certain designated areas and meet up with British aircraft carriers. My target was to fly over to Gibraltar, meet the captain of the Hunter, a small British aircraft carrier, 457 feet long, and give him the papers and nobody else. I was the only American on board that British carrier. A few days later, we proceeded eastward through the Mediterranean and wound up down at Malta. We were joined in this area by a total of 6 aircraft carriers. And we started out after about a 2 or 3 days wait in Malta up through the Straits of Messina. And we were headed for an area just southwest of Sorrento. As we were going through at night, the Italians were celebrating the pulling back of the Germans up into this area toward Rome. And the next day, it was an amazing thing. I was the only American on board with all these British boys flying Seafires. It was an airplane, a Spitfire, rigged up to be a carrier landing airplane. And they were providing support to the landing troops. I mean, in here there were British and Americans. And one of my reasons for being there was not only to deliver the war plans to the captain of the ship, but to identify our P-51s that were now in the area and the A-36s, for the British to understand that these aren't Messerschmitts. So, and while we were en route up in there, all our airplanes were being changed in color so that it would make it easy for the British and the carrier and the British pilots to recognize a P-51 or an A-36. We were off here, I don't remember anymore just how many days, 5 or 6 days, while the landings were going on up there. And then I was sent back to my outfit then. And but it was quite an experience being the only American on board. These boys from Rhodesia, Australia, Canada, and the different British colonies. A great bunch of guys.
Tell us what happened, how you were shot down and became a POW.
After we had been stationed at Manfredonia for a short while, we moved on up to Foggia, and we were flying missions from Foggia up through the central part of Italy, trying to drive the Germans back up. We were also flying missions over to Yugoslavia and so on. It was kind of a fluke. I had already flown 50 missions, and my group commander called me in, and we had quite a discussion about keeping the pilots rotating, because as you approached your number, there was evidence of people getting a little nervous and so on. And I was squadron operations officer at the time, and so we told the boys, look, some of you are ready to return before 50 missions. Some of you can continue longer. We don't think it's fair to say, here's a number you have to fly. If you're ready to go home for various reasons, you're not really top combat oriented, best thing is to go home. And I told my squadron, I said, I won't ask anybody to fly any more than I would. On my 55th mission, it was a hurry-up thing. One of the co-pilots didn't feel too good that day, and I just happened to be there. My group commander just told me he wanted me to take over the squadron and squadron commander. And well, can I talk to you about it tonight, General? Anyhow, we took off, and I was flying co-pilot for another flight leader, Lieutenant Anderson, who eventually wound up in prison camp with me too. We were sent up to Perugia to bomb, and we were the second wave of airplanes going in on a target that had German airplanes scattered all around. This target was 80 miles north of Rome. The bombardier that we had in the lead airplane thought he saw more of the targets further away than where we had planned his bomb drop. We stood on the bomb run a little too long. Once you're on the bomb run, you got to stay straight and level to try to hit your target. And we suddenly, there was a burst of flak right in front of us. And then another burst of flak, and I could hear it rattle. Lieutenant Anderson was doing a great job flying, but we were on the bomb run too long. That's fatal. We got hit. The wheels came down, the right engine caught fire. We couldn't get the fire out, couldn't get the wheels back up. And fire was coming in over the center wing section of the B-25. And I told Anderson we're going to have to bail the crew out. And I was a captain, he was lieutenant. We were kind of co-leaders anyhow. So we ordered a bailout. We couldn't do anything to save the airplane. And we got the crew out. I found out later, a year and a half later, that our bombardier had bailed out, but he had been shot down by a German Army unit on the ground, shot him in his parachute. I landed with two of my other crew members, and we were within a half mile of a German garrison, and we were captured. The airplane, by the time I bailed, I was the last one to bail out. And I remember Anderson saying, "Go ahead, Merle." I was a co-pilot. I said, "No, you get out." I said, "I'm in charge." And he went out, and then...
Was that the first time you'd ever parachuted out of a plane?
First time I'd ever parachuted out of a plane, too, and I did it the wrong way.
What was that like? Yeah.
You don't think too much about what it's like, but I debated. I took my glasses off. Mm-hmm. As being the last one out, I rolled the trim tabs forward so that it would keep going down. We had already slowed down below safe flying speed. And Anderson had gone out, and I went back, and I was supposed to dive out. I didn't do it. I went out feet first, and I finally pulled myself loose, and I was gone. But floating down, I was only, it seemed like 1,000 feet or so above the ground, but I tried to get the parachute under control, which I did, and I saw the airplane go in and hit a tree, and it totally tore it up, which I was happy about because we had Norden bomb sights on, and we wanted to be sure they were destroyed. And then a day or so, well, later that day, I was
Did you land near
captured.
Anderson? Did you land near each other?
Three of us did. Mm. And we were taken back to the city jail in Perugia.
Where were you when you were captured? Did they have guns? How were you captured?
They were German soldiers from a garrison. Fortunately, there were a couple of Italians there. The Italian farmer whose field we tore up where the airplane hit, he came after me with a pitchfork because I was glad the Germans were there. And we stayed there for about 3 days and 3 nights. In the meantime, the Germans took us one at a time into their headquarters and tried to ask us a few questions, and they had to get orders from their headquarters of what to do with these airmen.
So now here you are, a farm boy from Pennsylvania, a prisoner of the Germans. That must have been quite earth-shaking for you. I mean,
it was
hardly even real.
From Perugia, I was put on board a Ju-52 along with 30 other Germans that was flying north to near Verona. There was an old castle that the Germans had in there as an interrogation center. And eventually, the next day after the flight up in the Ju-52, I'm taken into a nice office. German uniformed gentleman speaking perfect English. First thing he did, he said, and I don't remember his name, he said, "Be sure and tell me straight, because I left New York in 1935. And And I said, well, I'm Captain Culp, serial number so-and-so. And I said, there's nothing else to tell you, sir. And of course they go through their routine, and he said, well, I don't need much information from you. He said, I've got a book that thick. And he showed it to me. They had the names of and the numbers of all our airplanes. The one thing he didn't have was the name of our newly assigned a chaplain to our outfit. And it was real easy for me to say, well, I can't help you even if I could. I've never met the man myself. And so they tried to get me to sign along. They called it a Red Cross form. Well, I refused to do it. Of course, they refused to feed me very much for several days. Finally, I got a dull razor and shaved. Other than having to eat nasty food and dry bread and stuff, the worst thing, it was cold as the devil. They put me in a darn old cell. And they give you the usual routine of hearing gunfire right outside. Well, we're going to have to do something like that. But then...
Oh, as though they were executing people, you mean?
Well,
yeah.
They tell you that's what they threaten you with.
Mm-hmm.
And I got to the point where I was a little bit disrespectful to him, so I just couldn't be respectful to the darn Nazi. Anyhow, a couple of days later, I was loaded on an airplane, loaded on an electric train, going, it turned out, over the Brenner Pass, through Innsbruck, and eventually up through Frankfurt, where we underwent a bombing raid and wound up after 2 weeks here at Stalag 1.
How big was Stalag 1?
Stalag 1, when I got there in February of 44, had about less than 2,000 people. And it grew by sections where the total population was approximately 10,000.
What nationalities were in there with you? What nationalities were in there with you?
Well, mostly British boys, and nearly all American.
No
all
Russians?
American officers. The enlisted men were sent to different camps. And Stalag 1 was not like what we usually see in the TV movies.
It wasn't, huh?
No.
Captain Clinker, was that his name? What was it like? You were there for about a year.
We were treated fairly well. We got a bath once a week. We got ersatz coffee and black bread, and we got barley soup. When we were first going in there hungry, we ate the barley soup. The rest of the Kriegies kind of laugh at us because they say, hey, look what's moving. A lot of the barley soup had maggots. But then we started getting our Red Cross parcels approximately once a week.
What would you do every day?
We'd play cards. We'd try to figure out what can we do to harass the Germans. We try to write letters. We got out and played in a compound.
Did you ever see a deck of Red Cross cards that had secret escape maps on them?
I never saw any of those. We did get Red Cross parcels that we especially looked for and knew what to do with them.
There's a picture here. Would you tell us the story behind this picture? This is while you were a prisoner of war.
As I was walking into the prison camp on arrival, very much dejected, among no friends except British boys and American boys that were flying out of England. I didn't know any of them. As I'm waiting in line to be processed by the Germans for a photograph and so on, the American prisoners that are behind a fence are all looking out to see if they knew anybody. And suddenly, it's sort of a mid-afternoon, as I recall, I heard a voice, Culp. Hey, Culp. What am I hearing? I turned toward the noise and I said, who's calling Culp? He said, it's me, Fisher. I said, Fisher? He said, yeah, Fisher. I said, it can't be, you're dead. I had seen his airplane go down in the Sea of Corinth here, in the Corinth Canal, on a mission that we flew here. And we knew he was dead, because nobody ever got out of a B-25. Well, after I got into the prison camp and got settled down, I managed to get in the same room, get him in the same room where I wound up too. Fisher had been injured in the accident, broke his right arm, and he's still in a cast. And as we finally got together, Fisher managed to get some, through the help of our trader, some watercolors to start painting again. He was quite a good artist in his day. And the picture that he did of me was done with his left hand and with watercolors that we got from the Germans in prison camp.
And he was right-handed.
He was right-handed, but he did that with his left hand, following the old impressionistic type of painting.
And this is you.
That is I. And I kept trying to remember how I got that thing back home from prison camp. And it finally came to me the other day. Fisher, because he was injured, got repatriated about 5 or 6 months before the end of the war. And in his cast, he had some stuff wrapped up, including that painting, and I managed to recover the picture from him in St. Louis when I saw him next, about 1946. And he was a famous portrait artist at that time. Married a lovely girl, and they worked around the University of Washington in St. Louis. Fisher's now gone.
What year were you released then from prison? What was the date? Of course, 1945, but what was the date?
The Germans were approaching us, excuse me, the Russians were approaching us from the east. And we could hear the gunfire and so on. And this was sometime in late April, early May, as I recall. And the release took some time because we were in the sector of Germany that wasn't under control of the Americans. It was in a British sector. The Germans are being harassed by gunfire from the Russians coming in. And I don't know the exact date that the Russians showed up, but fortunately we had in the north compound of our Stalag 1, there's Colonel Hub Zemke, who was of Russian or Polish descent, and a couple of Polish boys.
He was the Zemke Wolf Pack. Was the name of his group was called the Zemke Wolf Pack?
Right. Oh. I didn't get to know him personally, but I knew who he was from communication. He managed to work a deal with the Russian general coming in. You guys go ahead and do what you have to do, but we'll stay right here. And it took 2 or 3 weeks for the Americans and the British to get B-17s to come in and land on the airfield near our prison camp. to haul us out.
Now, did you know that that we were winning, that the Germans were losing? Did you have a sense of that as a prisoner toward the end?
During our whole stay there, we had the benefit of the ingenuity of the early British prisoners in this camp who had been captured at Dunkirk. Most of them got repatriated after 5 years, but they were able to, at one time, have 20-some crystal radios. We were able to, through the British ingenuity, get the BBC. And it was always about 3 weeks ahead of the German news. The news was always something that we had to portray very carefully. We'd draw maps like this, but we'd show the German positions on it. But we always knew pretty well where we were. We worked on tunnels, kept busy.
Always with the goal of escaping? Always with the goal of escaping in mind?
Oh, yes. And then sometime in late 1944, we got word, do not attempt to escape anymore. Because at that time, there had been rumors and orders out that Hitler had ordered Himmler to wipe out all field-grade officers. But Himmler didn't go through with it. And even though I was on our local escape committee in the prison camp, there were all sorts of rumors, but there appeared to have been some evidence somewhere that these orders had been put out. While I was in prison camp, I had charge of a barracks of about 160 prisoners. And one of the German Luftwaffe officers that came around to visit us and inspect us about once a week was named Herr von Beck. He was an Austrian who had owned a piece of property along the Danube in Austria. He was no longer pro-German. He became very friendly with us, especially when we plied him with cigarettes and so on. And he was able to get information to us. My other roommate, Joe Marsiglia, spoke fluent Italian, German, and so on. And he became the only authorized trader in our section of the camp, T-R-A-D-E-R, to trade with Germans who would get things for us, for cigarettes or chocolate bars. The cigarettes, of course, are our medium of exchange.
Where did you get the cigarettes? Where did you get the cigarettes?
Cigarettes came in our Red Cross
Oh,
parcels.
got it. Okay. Yeah. Okay.
And we get what they call D-bars. That was a chocolate bar. It was worth 50 cigarettes. The others were mostly Lucky Strikes or Chesterfield. Those of us that didn't smoke became wealthy. Mm-hmm. And of course we had for a while we had a barber shop we set up. We'd cut hair because we were able to trade the Germans out of a pair of scissors and comb and whatever to operate our little barber shop.
So the war ended and you were put on board a B-17 and flown out?
Once we got toward the end, we organized 8 different companies within our prisoner group. One of them was a paratrooper who knew all about taking care of bombs and booby traps. He selected 20 people that he knew of, so that as soon as we were released, we were going to go over to this airfield, which is 5 miles away, the home of a concentration camp, also the home of some activity on the ME-262 jet airplane, which we saw on occasion. I can't remember his name now. As soon as they got out and the Germans took off ahead of the Russians allowed us to go around, He got over to the airport and made sure everything was cleared of any bombs and booby traps so that airplanes could come in. Then we had to get the word back through the British to the Americans. It's okay to fly in whatever airplane you can to take us out. My job, as another group, was to secure the flak school. It was a school the Germans had right close to where we were, but it was where they stored all our Red Cross parcels. So we captured that. We also had another group whose responsibility was to get the city bakery, get the city waterworks, and so on. Another guy organized what he called the death squad. As the Russians approached, German women were committing suicide like mad. They were scared to death of that. And they organized a group with the city mayor and so on. All the city officials claimed they didn't know what was going on in this concentration camp. But I personally visited the concentration camp myself, and it's something that makes your blood boil and you think how inhuman people could be. The smell of typhus is overpowering. But we managed to get a burial detail.
So the people had to know what was going on there.
That's right. Yeah. It was terrible. But we were burying quite a few people. A lot of them were that were in this concentration camp were political prisoners from France and from Italy that had been there suffering from typhus and dying off quite rapidly. In the meantime, we got organized so that the airplanes could come in, and the deal was that B-17s would come in and land. There's one big long runway that was usual. Taxi around, and we'd have 20 prisoners, Crees, Americans, whoever, ready to get on the airplane. They had taken B-17s and put seats in the bomb bay. 20 guys get on board, the airplane and taxi on around and take off for Camp Lucky Strike at Reims in France. And for some reason or other, I kept helping with this sort of stuff, and I think I was next to the last airplane hauling out 10,000 prisoners of war. Now, a lot of prisoners had tried to go cross country on their own. I don't know how they made out. Some apparently made it, some didn't, I'm sure.
So you arrived in France free. The war was over. You arrived in France and you were free, and the World War II was over. Well, that portion of it was over.
As I flew down the Ruhr Valley, I was able to see the desolation that we had created in that entire manufacturing area that the Nazis had controlled in there. The pilot of the B-17 very graciously took me down there about 50 feet above the ground. Of course, we had a load of 20 boys in Bombay, too. So his primary mission was to get us to Reims, but everybody wanted to look at and see what we had done.
Yeah.
Then we got to Camp Lucky Strike to await transportation, hopefully, to get back to the States.
But you instead chose to go back to your original
I got a pass
group
from the camp commander to go to Paris. And I hitchhiked my way by bus, whatever, till I got down near Le Havre. And I had no money or anything. But I conned a mess sergeant at an army base there into feeding me something. And I said, how do I get to Paris? So I can get to a processing office and get some money. So, well, he said the train leaves shortly and so on. I got on this American train, met some lovely people going in there, and I got to Paris, got to a finance office and got a $75 check. I had very little in the way of a complete uniform. But while I was there, I found out that my commanding general was staying at the Ritz Hotel in Paris. He was on his way from our base in Italy, which was our last base for the 321st Bomb Group. He was awaiting conferences and instructions prior to going back to the States for further business. And we were glad to see each other, General Knapp. And he asked me if I'd like to go back to my old outfit. Well, I wasn't married or anything, and I had already been up to Reims, and I could see all the prisoners waiting there. And they didn't know when they could get out of there. Nobody knew when we'd be able to go home. So I said, absolutely, I'd love to go back. And so he said, okay. Colonel Bill Bowers, who had been one of General Doolittle's crewmen, was his co-pilot. They had flown a B-25 from Italy up to Paris. So I said, General, I'd love to go back. Can you sign me out some orders? He said, oh, you don't need them. And I said, General, if you don't mind. So he wrote me out in his handwriting authorization to go from Europe, or from Paris back down to my outfit, the 321st headquarters in Italy.
And that's what you carried with you, is his handwritten order.
That's his handwritten order.
I have here a little newspaper article, obviously from your hometown. Ford City pilot decorated 4 times. Captain Merle H. Culp, 26, dubbed the best pilot in his squadron by fellow officers, recently received the Silver Star, the Distinguished Flying Cross, the Purple Heart, and the Air Medal. The pilot, assigned to the 321st Bomb Group in Italy, recently returned after 15 months in a German prisoner of war camp. He is the son of Mrs. Jessie Culp, Ford City. This is a magnificent piece. It's so wonderful that you've kept this. I'd like to thank you so much for coming in here today and allowing us to have this honor to interview you. This is an incredible piece of history that you've left with us for our country to have. You're a great American, sir, and this has been an honor to spend this time with you.
Well, thank you. It's a privilege to be here and to pass on something to other people. And it's been a privilege to represent my country to the best of my ability.
Mr. Culp, welcome back to the Warhawk Air Museum. Thanks
Pleasure.
for coming. Last time that we visited, we covered your military experience during World War II, and today we're going to move on into the 1950s and the early 60s at the end of your career.
Mm-hmm.
Merle, at the end of World War II, did you come back to the United States and stay in the military?
Yes. I was accepted as the new Air Force was formed as a regular officer, and had a couple of assignments behind the lines, so to speak, getting administrative experience. And in late 40s, the Air Force had a program of sending those of us who were lacking college training back to get college education. And I had been to Carnegie Tech night school earlier, and I went back, and the Air Force paid for 3 years of engineering training for me. Graduated in 1951 with a degree in mechanical engineering with the aerospace option. I was then assigned to right field coming out of there.
Were you married at this time?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Did you have any children?
No, and so I was free to move around quite a bit. I had a lovely wife. And
how long were you at Wright Field?
Well,
before you entered into the Korean War?
I got out of college. I was at Wright Field about a year and a half, and I was assigned to what they called the Service Aircraft Division under the new Research and Development Command. One of our problems was to support the airplanes and fighting units that were in Korea at the time. And it became evident that the boys over there needed help that they didn't appear to be getting. Wright Field was anxious to give them more support. General Partridge, who was four-star general in charge of research and development, decided to send a team over to Korea, and it included gunnery specialists, people who were in the so-called WISPOs, the Weapons System Project Offices, and I was one of them because I had B-29s, B-26 or A-26s, and that type of airplane under my jurisdiction. Carl Richardson had fighter aircraft and so on, and we were sent on a special team accompanied by General Partridge, which made it very nice. And we spent 4 months touring all the bases throughout South Korea, every fighter base and bomber base. We also made a side trip down to Okinawa for the B-29 trips. And
what was your impression of the bases when you got there?
The bases were gung-ho, doing a great job, but they were trying to solve some of their own problems locally. And we took every action we could to get them to communicate, and what did we have to do to make sure we were getting them quick answers. And I think what we were able to do, according to results, it helped everybody, and we did everything we could to shorten the Korean War. Our biggest problem over there was, of course, our gung-ho fighter pilots and everything weren't allowed to pursue things beyond the Yalu River. But they were great fighters. Gabreski and was one of them we met over there. And they were quite anxious to tell their story. Give us more help from the States. But it was a great trip. And one of the things we discovered was that the attack airplanes like the A-20s and so on had a problem going down into deep valleys, attacking trains and things that would back off into a tunnel during the day and come out at night. And how do you get down and attack those things whenever you can find one? The detailed studies that we made after discussion with all these commanders and many of the flight leaders resulted in an extensive effort when we got back to Wright Field. And that was the basis for developing the early specifications for what's today the Warthog. And it has taken years and years of development, but we kept refining it, and today it's one of the foremost fighting machines for that type of warfare. You
were involved in the 50s in another engineering project, and weren't you, that became a very important, successful project?
Yeah, I had the good fortune after a year and a half at Wright Field to get invited to go to Germany and participate in the new support of our American forces over there that were operating out of Ramstein and the various fighter bases. During the early part of the big scare from the Russians' capability to drop nuclear bombs. And I was assigned to the engineering division over there, and especially ground equipment. And we did all sorts of things, including developing local starter units for the F-100 airplane. We didn't have enough of the ones that were supposed to be shipped to us from the States. So the local boys said, we can do this with compressed air machines that we'll use here. And we had to approve that and test them and everything else. And we did. And it helped the effort. Shall I continue?
Yeah.
one day I was called in to see what we could do about the potential that the Russians seem to be building up of possibly dropping a nuclear bomb on one of our airfields. What would happen? General Tunner stated he would like to be able to move his airplanes, those that are flyable and those that might not be flyable but needed maintenance, 5 miles away from the center of a base. We, in my office, with the help of some very capable German engineers and a Captain Kron, developed a specification. We checked it out with everybody, and we started a development program to be able to transport any fighter airplane we had up to 5 miles over any kind of a surface with a truck or a bulldozer or whatever was available to get it out of harm's way. And the program was done in record time. We developed a model and a test plan, and we started developing in the final phase of the trailer that you see there with an F-86 airplane.
Did it have a name? Was it called anything specific?
It was just the air transportable trailer.
Had you seen the F-86 Saberjet before you were involved in this project?
Yes, and Chuck Yeager was a friend of ours. We went hunting together over there with General Mark Bradley and so on, so that made things easy. Chuck was anxious to help develop something, and he provided the F-86.
I'm showing pictures that you brought that are showing various airplanes. It looks like most of them are F-86s, but they're in different configurations on this trailer that you were part of the design committee for. The engineering engineers that put this project together. These are awesome. This is a pretty awful looking field. So was it successful? Could these be pulled through all kinds of...
The tests were very successful. Unfortunately, we didn't have to do much of that. But we were concerned about what happens to an airplane when you jerk it around through a muddy field and so on. And can the vehicle pull one wherever you want to go? And the test results were very gratifying. We were capable of pulling the narrowest landing gear airplanes, such as the F-86, to the F-84F, which had a very wide track. And this had to be capable of being handled by 2 GIs to back up to an airplane, connect to it, manhandle the aluminum ramps that we had so it could be loaded, hook up the necessary harness, and winch it onto the trailer and make it ready to tow away. Also, the parts of the trailer itself, disassembled, were capable of being hauled in an airplane from one base to another if we needed more of them.
And a 5-mile radius because of a potential atomic bomb drop, how much time was it supposed to take to do this whole process and get the planes out of there?
Well, we didn't get into that, but that was one of the results of our simplification of design and the ease of handling parts with just a few minutes and the availability of trucks here and there to do it. Mm-hmm. The interesting thing about this was there was a parallel effort developed on the part of our support at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base to develop a stateside vehicle that would do the same thing. We had ours done, ready, and in use in 1 year. The one that was developed by Letourneau didn't even come close to the specifications that we were working to. Price-wise, we built this for a price of roughly $5,000 to $8,000 per unit. the price that I had heard quoted by the laboratories at Wright Field was at Laterno wanted something like $60,000 for a unit that was very heavy and cumbersome and would not do what this would.
And you did this in Germany when you were in a base. Were
Yes.
German engineers involved with you?
Yes, I had German engineers assigned to our office, and then we depended on a contract with a bridge building company who also tested and built railroad cars and so on. So we were capable of using their engineers to develop this and test it with heavy concrete blocks and to make sure that it had the structural capability that would not result in a damaged airplane.
To your knowledge, were these used? Were these used?
Yes.
During the 1950s?
In practice events, but I left Germany for after being there 4 years, just as we were finishing up the initial design contract to go ahead and start building them.
Did your wife come to Germany and live with you?
Yes, initially, and then she returned for a while, and I stayed on for another 6 months or so.
And so when you came back to the United States, where were you reassigned?
I was reassigned to Wright Field and to the F-104 project office. As I was the associate manager of the F-104 WISPO. We had a combination of organizational development going on between the procurement offices and the Wright development offices. By this time, the F-104 had been in production, and one of the things I wanted to do, being brought in to see a new airplane, was learn how to fly the thing, and I had the opportunity to fly it some.
What was it like?
It was awesome. Can you imagine getting in an airplane? I had to go to ground school for about 2 weeks to learn all the systems. And we had one model that had 2 seats. And I had a flight with an instructor pilot, who's one of the Lockheed engineers and test pilots. And then my next flight was solo. And I had never used anything more in a jet airplane than the T-33 had. So here I was faced with an airplane with afterburners, a 4-stage afterburner, boundary layer control, drag chute, and a real high-performance engine. My first flight was awesome because I was a little too slow doing things, but I remember catching up to the airplane, getting the gear up, then getting the flaps up, and pull back the stick, come on, back. I was up to 500 miles an hour. And the interesting thing was, from the time your lease breaks, under normal flight conditions, you could be at 40,000 feet in slightly over 2.5 minutes. And then in another 2 minutes, you could level off and go Mach 2 plus. Unfortunately, the F-104 was a good interceptor airplane, but not something we needed in our inventory. And arrangements were made to transfer the whole production program to the Germans. And my successor at the Wright Field office went to Germany to head that up. And I believe the Germans bought something like 600 airplanes that were built over there.
How long did you stay at Wright-Patterson?
I had an opportunity to go to North American Aviation as the a project officer on the upcoming F-108, which was never declassified, but the similarity between it and the SR-71 is very similar. North American was building one, and Lockheed was building one too, both secret. I spent 4 years as the deputy plant representative at North American. During that period, the F-108 program got canceled out in favor of the SR-71. And
what happened at North American when it was canceled?
Well, they took over and continued to build the B-70. So I was there for the B-70 project, although I wasn't the primary officer in charge of that. Colonel Max Boyer was. And of course it was built, 3 of them successfully. I had an accident, of course. But the technology that went into all those airplanes was very similar. Something that would go Mach 3 and establish new speed and altitude records. While I was at North American, we also were finishing up the X-15 rocket airplane, which Scott Crossfield was the test pilot on. And it was capable of flying Mach 5, I believe, something like that. And it was a forerunner to a lot of the space activities here. Also at North American, we had a responsibility over, for government contracts, over some of the early Apollo programs at the North American Missile Division. There was Mr. Harrison Storms was the North American leader. I sat in on meetings with Werner von Braun and all those engineers who were putting together the necessary know-it-all and pre-contract talks about how to get the Apollo program underway.
What an exciting time for you. How much technology in the 50s actually came out of Germany?
Quite a lot of it. I recall something that happened while I was in prison camp in 1944. We, of course, were aware of the V-1 rockets coming from Germany over London and so on. And we knew that there was something happening. They were building another rocket, which had been named the V-2, which was not just a low-level pulse jet thing that would come in and bomb low, but something that had a lot of range.
How'd you know that? How'd you get the information when
Well,
you were POW?
it was available through various technical channels and so on. But what was so interesting, one very clear day, just like it is today out here, some of us were just shooting a bull out in the parade ground, and we were looking down towards Peenemünde, which is about 100 and some miles southeast of where we were. And it was quite a coincidence. Suddenly, I'm watching something and I see this white streak. This white streak going. We were used to airplanes flying around at a German base not far from us, but this was different. Boy, what can that be? And it went up, 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 up. And I'm not sure whether we knew or surmised at the time what it was, but we soon figured out it was one of the first flights, and I think the first flight, of the V-2 rocket being fired from Peenemünde. And that's what relates me back to Werner von Braun. That was his baby too. So there in 1944, I was witness to a fantastic sight. It kept going up and up and up.
You had an incredible life. My gosh. I mean, seriously, you think about starting off as a young man in fighting in Europe and being shot down, ending up a POW for part of your life, which is bound to have had an effect you know, on directions that you took consciously or unconsciously, and then to go into these engineering feats that that are just so historical.
I became a welder truck driver, worked for a factory company, worked for the Pittsburgh Plate Glass Company. We were building a new building. The engineer took a liking to me, and I wanted to help him survey and stuff. And one day the gentleman who was supposed to run the crane to help put up steelwork didn't show up. The superintendent came around and said, "Well, what are we going to do?" I said, "I can run that crane." And I became a crane operator.
See, now I know your secret. You're a can-do guy. That's
Anything
why.
that was a challenge.
Well,
I guess that was my theory.
Anything that was a challenge.
Right.
Well, I can't thank you enough for coming in and allowing us to do this very historical interview with you, to record it, to preserve your histories. You're a great American, and you certainly have contributed in so many different ways to what this country is today. I want to thank you for coming in, and we sure look forward to a lot more visits and a lot more chats with you.
Well, thank you very much.
About you and who you are.
I've had a lot of help from my associates, and even coming over here, my wife said, "Get ready."
Well, we hope you come back a lot.
Well, thank you for being interested. I hope it helps the program.